Let this sink in. 95% of what we do is dictated by these unconscious processes. I mean, talk about new meaning to Christ's maxim, forgive them, Father, for they know not what they do. I mean, we live our lives. This is what it means to be asleep. The Buddha is the awakened one, the ultimate lucid dreamer. This is what it means to be asleep. We're running on automatic ignorance. And also, astrology comes into play here because astrology works with these deep archetypal principles, I think, both internally and externally. And the genius of astrology is, I've come to understand it, is they can make these unconscious processes conscious. We become more aware of the forces internally and externally that really are guiding our lives. And then if we understand what those forces are, and this is the great revelatory gift I had with you and the work I did with the reading and then the 4E session, was for the first time in my life, I think I finally understood what astrology represents, at least for me. It's about becoming aligned with these amazing forces. And so if you do that, boy, then the wind is blowing at your back. And then you realize what if we carefully say it, providence or destiny is about. You're finally in tune with what you really are about. And these forces then, these 95% of the unconscious mind, boy, oh boy, completely resonant with what takes place at these deeper astrological principles. And for me, this was a game changer because I always thought, oh, astrology is just about prediction. And I said, geez, that didn't work for me. But finally, I realized, oh my gosh, I've been looking at this completely the wrong way. So big bow of gratitude for you, because that to me has been colossal.
Welcome to the I Don't Believe in Astrology podcast. The podcast is dedicated to conscious souls looking to change the world. Astrologer by day, climate activist by night. Here is your host, Debra Silverman.
Debra Silverman, guess what the name of my podcast is? You're going to laugh.
Something about I don't believe in astrology, I think.
That's
right?
it. He's
Yeah.
smarter than he looks. He's smarter than he looks. Just warning, just giving you a heads up. We got 2 Geminis in the room. I don't believe in astrology. I don't think that was your beginning when we met, but you hadn't had a proper reading, right? Or you had a little glimpse of it, but not quite.
Yeah, maybe 20 years ago, if not longer. Yeah,
So-
long time.
So let's begin with that. I'm at Esalen. I want to tell the story.
Okay.
And then I'll introduce you to Andrew. It was a very random occurrence. I can't even tell you, it's such a strange story, why I took the class. I hadn't been to Esalen probably maybe it was like 15 years. And I used to teach there for many years. I taught for 7 years at Esalen. So I was like, oh, and I walk into this room and I'm having a class called Preparing for Death. Oh, that's right. And I had a 700-page book I had to read before I got there, which was Andrew's, that I'd been sitting with for completely consumed me on the airplane flying around, reading. And then I walked in and I was like, really? Am I going to talk about death? I think we're going to talk about death for the next 3 days.
3.5. Yeah, it was great.
Magic. Okay, now let's just describe for my audience who doesn't know you. Andrew is an incredibly gifted teacher. That's the nature of Gemini. We will be pulling up his chart. His teachings changed. I don't even know if you know this. You changed my life.
Oh, you're so sweet. Oh my gosh.
But it's just true because I had a secret. I always said I had a mistress that I couldn't tell anybody about because you know how it is with mistresses. And it was called death. I never told people because it felt so just didn't feel right to be telling everybody how obsessed I was. And it's the other part to that was I had a secret, hurry up and let's get there already, unconscious part of my psyche. It was like, I'm so ready, which was not, my kids did not like that attitude. So when I came back from your workshop and I said to them, you know what I figured out? Whether you're dreaming on this side or that side, there's not a lot of difference.
Yeah, true. Yeah, all a dream.
And that was the changing for me of really reducing my fixation on wanting to go home and realizing, the dream occurs on both sides. And the dreamer knows that, which is what you taught me.
Cool. Oh, I'm so glad. That's really awesome.
I'm one of your very good students. I like when the interviewee, I always ask them to introduce themselves, although we have an incredible bio here written down. Can you put into words just who you are and what you do?
Oh Lordy. Yeah. Okay, I can give it a try. Well, I guess classically educated, trained as an aspiring concert pianist. So my first degree is in music. I have a deep, heartfelt relationship and still passion for the sciences. So I studied physics, graduated with a double degree, and then thought about, geez, what am I going to do for my life? Physics isn't quite it. Music isn't quite it. So my whole family was in the health sciences. So I said, well, I can do this thing. So I went and got a doctorate in dental surgery. And all the while, the real education, Deborah, as you know, is the so-called psychospiritual aspect of it. Really deep, long, concerted student seeker of reality. Eventually found my way to the Buddhist tradition. And I guess you could say for text purposes, I've been a card-carrying Buddhist for 40 plus years. But as you well know, I'm more a curist than a Buddhist. I'm more just really interested, very curious about the nature of mind and reality. And so, yeah, I've written 9 books. I do studies. I create studies with scientists. I work out. I did a 3-year retreat. So in the meditation arena, I've been a really pretty deep diver in that world. And so for the last couple decades, I've been not of my own volition, but almost kind of called into the role of being a so-called teacher, even though the word spiritual teacher totally creeps me out. I don't consider myself that.
Like, okay, stop right there. This is so good. I want to show your chart just so
Okay.
and my audience can get to know. This will really help when you said he abhors being a teacher. 2 planets in Gemini, 3 in the 11th house of the futurist. So one of the flavors of your chart, we always pay attention to what house the sun falls in, what part of the sky the sun was in. And it's in the house of science, but it's the futuristic science that allows us the bridge to where we're headed. So as a Gemini, you're fascinated, but you're always aiming at how can we help make the bridge between that world and this world, in your case, between the death world, Saturn and Scorpio. Look at this, you guys. He has Saturn in Scorpio, his life lesson. It's right here in English. Saturn in Scorpio rules death and the deepest, darkest parts of the psyche that includes the right use of meditation to get us to the calm place, which is opposite. He has Venus in Taurus, the musician. Venus in Taurus in the top of the chart. Venus rules our most refined expression of this life in Taurus, the musician, in the house of the professional. I heard him play piano and I was like, this doesn't even make sense. He went from being this teacher that he hated being to being this Buddhist that's meditating forever. And now he's playing piano. Oh, that's right. And he's a dentist. I'm so confused. Okay. And then we see he's Leo. This is actually inaccurate. I think you're Cancer rising, which we had this long debate about. But the most important thing that I want to finish with at the chart is this is very unusual, only happens once every 12 years. Jupiter, this number 4, it looks like number 4, sitting next to an antenna system, Uranus, in the sign of Cancer in the house of the dreamer, that one of the highest gifts that Andrew has given is translating the dream world in vibration, not just with words, but as a frequency that he imposes by making us all reconsider, why are we limiting ourselves with this concept that this reality is all we've got? What a stupid story.
Cool. Yeah. It's a really stupid story scripted by a really crappy author with a really shitty ending. It's called Death. And so my charter is to rewrite that story with a happy ending because the story actually doesn't end, right? And that's the idea, that just like you were alluding to before, it's just a dream. And you just, at the end of life, you just transition from one dream to the next. Dream is just code language for a manifestation of mind. So you're always just cascading through one manifestation of mind to the next. Pretty cool.
Always cascading from one state of mind to the next. So one of your gifts is, because for some of us, this is very abstract, very advanced language. And I sat through those days at Esalen in your class that I'm taking with you guys. It's so important because what I realize is my mind doesn't like this conversation. I mean, the mind has an undermining value to want to sabotage the capacity for us to open. I don't know who came
Wow.
the guy, but he's built to lock you down.
Yeah, so true. This is where we have to define the different dimensions of the mind, right? So when you're talking about the mind that you're referring to, this is the kind of classic Western, rational, logical, shrink wrapping, paranoid, infected, scientific, materialistic bullshit mind, right? Hey, it has its place. We wouldn't be communicating with this amazing medium if we didn't have that choice. But boy, oh boy, the larger mind that you and I really are rolling in, the mind that transcends the conventional mind, that's really what waking up, that's what ultimate lucidity in the dream world refers to, is waking up from the nightmare of appearance, overthrowing the tyranny of appearance, and finding out what's behind the curtains. When you pull it back, what's actually really there. And that's going to be revealed according to these wisdom traditions when we are forced to pull those curtains back when we die. Hey, why not die before we die? I mean, this is a great exhortation in Western philosophy. You'll find it in Christian mysticism, Sufism, the Zen tradition. If you die before you die, then when you die, you will not die. So there you have it.
And you can't take your ego to the funeral.
Say again?
You can't take your ego with you to the funeral.
Oh, yeah, that's the best thing. Yeah, you can't, ego can't attend its own funeral, right? And so here we are all on the spiritual path, wanting to broadcast our awakening. I can't, wait till my neighbors see how enlightened I am. Well, yeah, ego cannot attend its own funeral. So eventually that's what you cut through. That's what dies, because illusion dies, deception dies, fake news, crappy stories dies. And that's all that ego is, right? It's just this narrative that we constantly tell ourselves that keeps us hypnotized, that keeps us asleep, seemingly cozy and comfortable in this world, but basically, it just ensures all our anxiety and suffering.
It's such a profound, I just want to slow it down because we're two little Geminis.
Okay.
I'm going to reveal a secret that no one knows except my husband. And I'm not going to go into detail, but I want you to hear this. Just recently, I gave myself, through my intuition, through a meditation, the instruction to use some medicine to take me to another world, which I know you support, the whole use of hallucinogenics and ayahuasca and all these. Now, I'm not going to say the name of what I did, but what happened was, and I really wanted to unpack this with you. Of course, I left this world behind willingly because I don't have a strong attachment. So I don't have to suffer because I've taken your class and I came this way. I don't suffer from the fear of letting go of Debra. She's annoying anyway. I mean, everywhere I go, she's there. I can't get rid of her. So I'm happily to unpack and say, could you just sit there, honey? We're done. The interesting part was I went to another dimension that had multiple dimensions inside of it. And I had a all access pass. Little did I know,
Oh, cool.
They invited me in and I was allowed to go anywhere. I wasn't allowed to participate with what I saw, but I could witness. And I thought of you because, one, my body, obviously under this medicine, I couldn't move. I was completely without words. It was beyond this extreme state of where we live. And what I realized was, uh-oh, is this true? This place goes on forever in every direction?
Well, it depends on that place. If you're talking about mind, I mean, this is such a, we're going so deep right away, right? There is no place outside of the mind itself, right? Just like like a dream. Again, so when you think about it, this is so cool. When you're in a dream, sure as heck appears to be real, sure as heck appears to be a place, but it's only when we wake up into a truer dimension like this, provisionally, and look back upon that so-called dreamscape and call that the dream space, we realize that what we thought was so bloody real, a place itself, is just a manifestation of mind. So when you talk about that place, I might just gently invite you to look at perhaps that place again is just another expression of the manifestation of mind. It's ego that comes in and reifies it, solidifies it, concretizes it, and says, hey, here's this place. Well, this goes really deep, really fast because there is no place other than the mind itself. And that's one way to talk about what I think awakening, so-called enlightenment, might actually be, is really realizing truly that in hearts, it's all heart. We use the word mind, but that's such a limited word. I think it would be better to talk about it as heart, mind, spirit, because then it has a much more rich, almost beneficent quality, kind of almost even divine quality. And I think that's super important because otherwise it just becomes kind of this cold, cerebral, philosophical thing instead of what it really is when you wake up to it, which I suspect when you had the experience, I suspect it was probably quite remarkable, loving, caring, divine, just, otherworldly in that sense that it felt like, well, there's something pretty cool going on here.
Yes. So you're saying the mind in your definition, because in astrology, the sun and Mercury always travel together. Like in your case,
Okay.
the sun was in Gemini and Mercury was in Gemini. So they're always, it's either one sign in front or behind. Mercury is the planet of the mind in astrology. It
Okay.
describes the intellectual process. And
Yeah.
you're describing, and this is what the esoterics speak to, is there's a higher mind
Yeah.
who's aware of the lower mind.
Correct. Totally. Super important. Super important. Because again, yeah, this is so great because when you get into this kind of granularity, you have to be, or it helps to be more refined, more sophisticated in the words we use and whatnot, because here we are, we're using one word. It's called a multivalent term, mind, which means it's one word that refers to a bunch of different things. And so when you're talking about astrology, I'm hearing this, like I mentioned earlier, this kind of more rational, logical, deductive kind of approach, which again has its purpose. It's tremendously valuable in working with the world. But if you think that's the only way, ooh boy, are we in trouble? So then there's this larger mind, you can call it mind at large, the infinite field of subjectivity. If we're really careful, you could call it God. Doesn't really matter what you call it, but there's definitely something much bigger than you that is also part of you. And in fact, to come back to the death and dying narrative, what happens is that small mind, like a whirlpool, at death dissolves into the big mind, into the big stream, which never ends. And that's one way to talk about both enlightenment and the death process. And so getting familiar with that, becoming more comfortable with that through spiritual practice, through these medicines, plant medicines and the like, can totally
The
grease the
meditation
skids for
that
this.
you teach, which I've been using ever
Yeah,
since, such simple, hand on your heart. But I want to ask the question again. So is it true that
sure.
time is on forever in every direction? Because what I realized once I came out of
Ah,
this strand of consciousness and I entered that, you're right, another strand, and yet I saw this outskirts. I was like, oh my goodness, this thing goes on. Is that real? Like, is there no such thing as an ending?
well, that's so cool. And okay, now we're really going to the deep end. Because even Einstein said the following, and there I can name a dozen different world-class scientists, philosophers, physicists alive today who will tell you unequivocally that space, time, and causality themselves are constructs. They're made up. They're not the scaffolding of reality. They're constructed. They come up co-emergent with a very sense of self. And so on a provisional level, yes, for sure. We have this thing called space. We have time. We have causality. Again, that's where the relative mind works. But on the deepest possible level, you could say either trans-temporal, trans-spatial, or pre-temporal, pre-spatial. There's a dimension of existence that doesn't abide by these principles of space, time, and causality. And we can see this in our dreams. This is why when you're in a dream, a nighttime dream, all these miraculous things can take place. You can do all these things where the laws of physics don't really apply. Well, it's because space and time have been partially deconstructed in that dimension. And
Right.
so when you have an experience like with the medicines, it's super similar. There's a dimension where space and time are still relatively operative until you go all the way down to the reduction base where there is no space and time. But this is where all the amazing experiences, the deja vu, all the so-called mystical psychic stuff takes place. It seems so kind of paranormal. But I always say, Debra, that these agents, these medicines, these meditations, the dream practices and whatnot, they don't bring you into altered states. They bring you into the natural state. This is the altered state. Seeing this world as solid, lasting, independent, dualistic. This is the altered state. It's only that we've been tripping on it, double meaning intended, so long we mistake this to be real. And so when we have these so-called mystical experiences, they're just rips, they're temporary, falling through the fabric of conventional reality into what's really real. And that's why when you have these experiences and you come back, it doesn't matter what anybody tells you. You know that where you've been is more real than this. And that's why you're willing to take refuge in that and pursue it the way you and I both do.
That's so profound. So let's talk about it from a psychological point of
Okay.
view, from a therapist, because that's my practice. If the human condition has this limited operating system that is totally seduced by what you described, it's a very limited point of view that's tripping hard and really believes it's tripping. And yet there's another angle that's waiting for us, but yet really hard to interface with, almost without the
Uh,
medicine, without the meditation, without the intention. What would be the reason that that we would have a closed system like this? How does it serve, or what is it serving?
oh yeah, these are great questions. Wow. So here's the way I understand it, and this is why I mentioned earlier I'm a curious more than a Buddhist. Well, part of my curiosity has led me into integral studies, a way to look, honor, abide, respect all the different wisdom traditions, East and West. And so, from an evolutionary point of view, from a developmental point of view, we need to be able to operate at this relative egoic dimension. There's nothing wrong with ego. Ego is just an arrested form of development. Excuse me. So, what you're trying to do is transcend, but include the ego. And so here's the image. Ego is like age, I don't know, 16. Well, when you grow from 16 to 17, you don't kill age 16. You transcend it, but you include it. And so this is super important. Therefore, it means this egoic dimension where we really have to be able to separate self from other. If we didn't have this capacity, like I playfully say, we wouldn't be here talking about this. We would be a chicken McNugget in the Serengeti. We would never evolve to this point. Our immune system wouldn't operate.
Serengeti.
Our immune system wouldn't operate if we couldn't separate self from other, antigen from antibody. So we need, in an evolutionary sense, to be able to separate self from other provisionally. But the issue is we get stuck. It's a constipated, arrested form of development. And so therefore, the path is, okay, I'm going to use this thing called ego. I'm going to use the rational mind. I'm going to use my logical mind to communicate with others and to relate to those who are still almost exclusively identified with that dimension of reality. But part of the path in this kind of transcend but include narrative is, hey, the view is so much better from up here. It's so much freer. There's so much more air. It's just more spacious. It's more magnificent. I'm going to hang out up here. To a certain extent, you don't want to get lost in that kind of spiritual space and spiritual bypassing.
You talked about your earth. Yeah,
exactly. Yeah, totally.
Beep, beep.
So yeah, I think that's super important. It's a way to honor and include the dimension of experience that we're having to actually treasure it. Because here's the deal, Deborah, if we set up a kind of adversarial relationship to the ego, where basically we start shadowboxing with an illusion and we ironically reify it, we make it stronger. So if we love it, is you know, the hand over heart thing that you mentioned is fundamentally learning how to love yourself to death, learning how to love your ego to death so that it's still there.
Oh, Mr. Gemini, love yourself to death. Why does that make me laugh? Okay, so can I just add this? It's really important. If I'm going to come back to human, because let's first of all talk about 4E and how best memories of you. We're doing 4E, his wife is there, and we're doing water. We go into water, and this is what Andrew looks like.
Totally.
Eyes are closed, and we're doing water, and he's like, I'm like, no one has ever smiled this much when I asked them to meditate and close their eyes. He's having a party all by himself in the water. He's finally at home. Then he goes over to Earth and he's like, I was like, wait, what just happened? The Earth thing did not please him. Although he's got it in his chart, he's built for the job. He can definitely get shit done. But that water element, you changed my point of view that day. He broke the code. He knows that the invisible world where the dream state exists, where meditation is our promise, there is this ecstatic state. Once you get past loneliness, once you get past empty, once you get past all that dark. How did you figure that out?
Well, you know, it's so interesting. I didn't figure it out. I fell into it, and this is important. This ties into what you said a little bit earlier. So we're going to tie two things together. When you mentioned or suggested that it's difficult to attain these particular dimensions. Well, it's only so difficult because we're so bloody contracted. These are actually the most open, natural of all possible states. It's only because we meaning ego, exclusively identified with contracted form, that, like we said earlier, ego can't attend its own funeral. Ego gets a little freaked out when things get too open, too vulnerable, too much full of love. And so ego defends itself against that because there's no room for personal identity in that space. Ego, in other words, doesn't exist in that space. So that's the only reason it's hard. It's developmentally challenging. because part of us, yes, we're on the psycho-spiritual path. We want to wake up. We want to become more evolved. That's that evolutionary end in the spectrum of our identity. But there's this kind of what I say, the devolutionary tail that wags the dog. There's a deeper, I wouldn't say deeper, but there's a more retro part of us. It's part of our legacy, our karmic habitual legacy, that doesn't want anything to do with this. And this creates this kind of bipolar conflict of interest. Part of you really wants to wake up, the other part wants nothing to do with it. And this is why when people get into the deep end of the pool, you're no longer window shopping, you're doing really deep spiritual practice. Boy, oh boy, some people just say, this is not for me, I'm not smart enough, I don't have enough time, and they hit the eject button, they're out of there. So this is where it's really helpful to understand the spectrum of your identity along these two different axes, because we don't exist on just one locus of identity. We're a fluid spectrum of being. You know this through your astrological principles. And part of that fluidity can be measured and assessed and evaluated. And then becoming aligned with that has been my big discovery working with you. We can start to see that, hey, I'm a really complex, messy, but also a beautiful being working along at least two or three different axes of identity. And by understanding that, boy, does this bring a lot of understanding about who we are and are not. And then maybe even more important, how to relate to others who are also fluid. Again, the water thing, this is why I'm so comfortable with water.
Exactly.
The fluidity of identity for me is just like, hey, I'm really easy swimming in this water. So this.
I really want to address this because it's water related, and it's the thing you said about love. In Saturn and Scorpio, one of the deepest wounds there is, if I was open enough to feel my love and I didn't push it away and keep resisting it and keep going into contraction, I would turn into a big blob of emotional vulnerability and I wouldn't function.
Totally. Yeah, that's the ego. And so again, tying this word into this four-letter word. By the way, if you flip it around, it spells the better part of the word evolve. Love is really another word for what mind is. I mean, when we talk about heart, spirit, mind as being the fabric of reality, another way to talk about it, and I don't think the wisdom traditions are fearless enough in proclaiming it, that the very fabric of this mind, this reality, is really made of love. And so if we understand that in our heart of hearts, tying it back to the death thing, well, if you know in your heart of hearts that when you die, you're going to cascade and fall into this matrix of unconditional love, I don't know about you, but that's going to make letting go at the end of life a whole lot better. That I'm going to dissolve back into this infinite open space that is beautiful and made of the fabric of love. This is a game changer. Oh my goodness. Instead of freaking out and fearing the end of life, you realize, wow, I actually really do have something to look forward to.
I just remember reading your book, and over again, I was like, he's like selling me on death. I felt like every page was another argument to make me realize, you better get ready. It's coming.
Yeah.
And by the way, it's not as bad as they say. And by the time I finished, I was like, okay, Mr. Salesman, you got me. And what I want to say about that is love and death in astrology.
Oh, yeah.
They're very connected, and Scorpios tend to push people away because they're so vulnerable and they don't want to disclose. Their ego won't let them be that exposed at the
That's
soul.
right.
So they protect themselves with a shield called I don't need you, which is not at all true, of course. And I noticed in myself after that experience I had, I was so vulnerable. I cried more. I mean, it's such a funny story without using any details. My heart opened so wide. My ego went so far beyond into another space where I love it, where it sits down. And I felt so vulnerable in that. How can I sustain this vulnerable, open, soft, energetic in the face of this assaulting?
Yeah, boy, these are great questions. Yeah, the way to do it is literally to become more and more familiar with that quality of openness and love. And so this is so cool. In the Tibetan language, the word for meditation is Gom, Gom. And it literally translates to become familiar with. That's such a compelling definition. Meditation is about becoming familiar with. Well, it's a twofold strategy. One is first becoming familiar with who you are not. what's called the via negativa. I'm not my body, I'm not my thoughts, I'm not this relative mind. And then in a certain way, you kind of back your way into the truth and you discover who you really are. That's the via positiva. That's the infinite big mind made of love. And so you become familiar first with who you are not, process of differentiation. Then you become familiar with who you really are, this infinite field of love. And that they both take time. We have to basically gradually, almost titrate, drip, become familiar with such degrees of openness, such degrees of love. Because again, it goes against the grain of everything we've been enculturated in the Western tradition, the scientific approach.
It's not even, I think it's a
Totally.
bullshit mechanism. But for some reason, I mean, this is what my new book is about, is the bad design. There's a built-in mechanism that shuts down the very thing you want.
That's right. That's right. And that's due to habit patterns, or in Eastern language, karma. It's due to the force, what I playfully call the forces of the dark side, the massive forces of the unconscious mind. And Chet, you know these numbers, Deborah, we've talked about it. Let this sink in. 95% of what we do is dictated by these unconscious processes. I mean, talk about new meaning to Christ's maxim, forgive them, Father, for they know not what they do. I mean, we live our lives. This is what it means to be asleep. The Buddha is the awakened one, the ultimate lucid dreamer. This is what it means to be asleep. We're running on automatic ignorance. And also, astrology comes into play here, because astrology works with these deep archetypal principles, I think, both internally and externally. And the genius of astrology is, I've come to understand it, is they can make these unconscious processes conscious. We become more aware of the forces internally and externally that really are guiding our lives. And then if we understand what those forces are, and this is the great revelatory gift I had with you in the work I did with the reading and then the 4E session, was for the first time in my life, I think I finally understood what astrology represents, at least for me. It's about becoming aligned with these amazing forces. And so if you do that, boy, then the wind is blowing at your back. And then you realize what if we carefully say it, providence or destiny is about. You're finally in tune with what you really are about. And these forces then, these 95% of the unconscious mind, boy, oh boy, completely resonant with what takes place at these deeper astrological principles. And for me, this was a game changer, because I always thought, oh, astrology is just about prediction. And I said, geez, that didn't work for me. But finally, I realized, oh my gosh, I've been looking at this completely the wrong way. So I'd be big bow of gratitude for you, because that to me has been colossal.
And I want to say, you have Mercury, I've told this before, and Mars together. It only happens once a year. That your mind, the ego, is hooked up to your male energy. So you're impassioned, your constant fascination, your mind never gets a break. I don't know, do you sleep well?
Oh, I sleep great, but I'm always learning even when I sleep, right? That's why I do the lucid dreaming thing. So
Yeah, that's a really good. I want to say that if any of you are interested in noticing, because I've spoken to this my entire career of almost 50 years, dreaming is another doorway that activates the awakening. It makes no sense. You go to sleep to wake up to the degree that you're lucid. And since I met you and I've done those practices before I go to bed, boy, has my dream world changed. And that's the invitation for all of you. I think what your gift to us is, and it's really still integrated, to be perfectly honest. I don't feel like I'm a very good meditator or a very good dreamer or a very good translator, but I am a good astrologer. I can give myself that. What I notice is the compulsion of my mind to listen to you and be entertained and stimulated and opened and really massaged. Like I feel like everything gets widened when you speak. And then I watch my ego mind go, how do I apply that?
yeah.
Sense? Is he got enough earth in his chart to make this thing useful? And I'm going to answer yes. To your credit, acknowledging me, it's shifted me. I have a totally different person from that weekend workshop.
Oh, Deborah, that means so much to me. I mean, really coming from you, that really deeply touches me. And it's so,
it's true.
yeah,
Because lineage. I want you all to hear this. When someone, just like I've done astrology for 50 years, how long have you been studying Tibetanism, Buddhism?
50 years. Yeah, I hate to say it, it's kind of scary. Yeah, 5 decades. Long. It's been a lifetime journey for me. Yeah.
Yes, the very same age group. And when you played piano and I saw your mastery, it reminded me, you inspired the part of me. And there's lots of people watching this who don't have the discipline. They don't have the follow through. They don't have the appetite. They don't have the
Mm.
consistency, and they judge themselves for being fickle or inconsistent,
Mm.
flirtatious. And it's true. And I'm going to tell you the evolutionary description of what I felt with Andrew when I left there was, oh, and here, I know you're not going to like this. And here we have a master, someone who's done 50 years of the same thing over and over and over again. Doesn't even matter if you like the word. You have reached a level of consciousness, and I hitchhiked on you. I went, and then I found out my best friend Ash had the same birthday as him, and many people in this audience know Ash, who's also, his language is exactly the same as you. Like,
Cool.
he calls sacred medicine an imaginary medicine for an imaginary disease. Like, his
Yeah.
whole thing is, why are we captured by the negativity of the mind's construct that
Yeah.
tells us something is wrong? And being Jewish, it's not easy for me because I mean, I grew up with the oi. My whole childhood was something's wrong. And what I experienced from the mastery of the mind brought to us through a long lineage is, how dare we think we know right from wrong based on.
Oh, no kidding. Good for you. I wanted to say a couple of things. Boy, you're hitting on such great stuff. I mean, one is, first of all, thank you so much for the kind, appending the word mastery. I think one thing around this that really resonates with me is it's really more a process of remembrance than it is of learning. And so Plato has a lot to say here. We live in his world, whether we know it or not. And he had a really interesting approach to this, just a little techno speak to share with your listeners. He talked about it as anamnesis, which is the process of recollection. It's a process of memory. We already know all this stuff. We just forgot. And so maybe the mastery has been, I maybe have remembered a little bit, literally remembered, by engaging in these unity or non-dual practices. The other thing, and this warrants some, I think, exclamation points as well, is that your listeners are going, wow, they're really talking about some lofty, heavy, deep stuff. Well, just like you say, and you mentioned earlier, like, how do I bring this into my life? Well, I playfully talk about these sort of teachings in the spirit of Reaganomics and the trickle down economics. This is trickle down spirituality, where you go, you shoot for the top. And this defines tantric practices in the Tibetan tradition. They're arguably the loftiest traditions. Dream yoga comes from the tantric tradition. And basically you shoot for the top because the view from here is so high. It's psychoactive, not in the drug sense. It's psychoactive in the sense that these teachings, and you suggested this earlier, they're so resonant with reality. They're so in harmony. They're constructs that are so in harmony with reality that just by reflecting on these, because this is real news, this is truth, these constructs will collapse into reality. And so that's how the trickle down spirituality works. You do the heavy lifting, you climb to the top, you go, what are they talking about? Why should I bother with this seemingly philosophical stuff? Well, it may seem philosophical or theoretical, but it's only because you haven't experienced it yet. None of this is philosophical. It's a direct experience of reality.
How
So,
old is the Tibetan conversation about the bardos? Like, when did that conversation begin?
oh, for me?
For the
Oh, gee.
like you too, for you, but when did the conversation of reincarnation enter the dialogue of the Buddhist?
Oh, it was there pretty much from day one. Because the Buddha, he was brought up in the developing Brahmanical or Hindu tradition. And rebirth reincarnation was a given. It was axiomatic. It was part of that construct. Yeah, exactly. So he inherited that, and he accepted it because it not only did it make so much sense, but it had so much explanatory power. And so
Was
he,
that like 3,000-4,000 years ago?
well, the Buddha lived around 2,500 years ago. The Hindus, Hinduism is the oldest world religion. And it goes back to the bowels of ancient mystic history. Nobody really knows when it
That's why
started.
I just want to say this and just plug this in. If any of you are not following or you feel like it's a stretch, just know this is a well-worn pathway. It's
Yeah,
part of the collective unconscious at the highest level on those mountains in Tibet where they're standing way up and they're trying to help us make the bridge back down here. So I
that's
think
it.
part of the Gemini, us being the Gemini connection of heaven and earth, we both have this fascination. Me, I love the earth and business. I love this conversation, and I invite all of you to think that this is a part of your practice. You cannot reach true awakening if you don't realize that you're excited about death.
The whole thing is about death.
But yeah, that sounded so bad.
No, it's so true. I mean, watch that beautiful two-part series, that documentary on the life of George Harrison by Martin Scorsese. At the end of the movie, this brilliant little clip where George Harrison said, my whole life has been about preparing for death. And so this is what it's all about, is understanding. I mean, I've been driven by it as deeply as you have. I wanted to penetrate the mystery of this thing called death. And here's the deal, tying it back to the Buddha, since you mentioned his kind of history here. This is what led to his awakening. It's literally called the supreme contemplation. The Buddha sat underneath a Bodhi tree 2,600 years ago, and in a moment of deep introspection and reflection, started at the end this thing called death. And then in a really sophisticated, insightful, almost like 12-step detox process, literally called the 12 steps of dependent origination, he literally linked his way back to that which causes and conditions death. And that first link is ignorance, not knowing. And so this is where it gets beyond profound. Death is a product of ignorance. And we're afraid of that because we're afraid of what we don't know. By transforming in an alchemical context in the West, a tantric context in the East, by transforming ignorance into wisdom, you transform death into awakening. It literally then becomes a once in a lifetime opportunity. And so this to me has been, I can tell you, and this is why the course you're taking, I'm so passionate about it. This is like been my whole deal, is like penetrate the mystery of death, understand what it is, understand that it's happening on micro cosmic levels all the time. And then, as you well know, by embracing your life in the arms of impermanence and death, it's not a morose, morbid occupation. There's nothing more powerful than bringing you more fully into life than contemplating impermanence and death. Nothing has made me more playful, more just invigorated with the joy of being alive than these reflections. It's huge.
Oh, I just love that so much. I noticed that you and I have this mental chemistry, that when we get together, that happened at dinner, we met that
Yeah.
night. It's interesting when, and this is something to entertain for all of you, when the practice is put in place through meditation, which we are both meditators, through contemplation, which we're both contemplators, through teaching and studying and listening, which is tattooed on my arm, listen and silent have the same letters. In order to really listen, there has to be the emptying of the construct that you already know. So that's the remembrance, is the innocence of curiosity. I have this in spades as I see it in you, where, and this is one of the things I love the most about myself. I cannot get enough information to learn and learn and learn. Like, I'm going to go watch that George Harrison documentary.
It's so cool.
If the mind has been put in its seat in the right relationship to your heart, then you'll fall in love with this place. If the mind has been put in its seat and it's driving the ship and it doesn't have your best interest and it says shit about you, and by the way, it's so confused, why are you following that thing?
That's right. Yeah, hit the mute button. Hit the mute button. And you said something else that's really pretty darn cool. You talk about how to incorporate this, how to bring it into your life. And one way is to engage in what you just talked about, which is this. I want to give it some formal structure, because people can walk away with this and say, whoa, I can work with this. This classic Indian, which means Indic, Hindu, Buddhist approach of hearing, contemplating, and meditating. This is important because it's a way to take all this stuff, bring it into your body, bring it into your system, literally incorporate it and bring it into your life. So the hearing part is what we're doing here, flapping our lips and talking about the stuff. Contemplation is what it sounds like. You start to bring the material into your system. You go from ingestion to digestion. You start to really work it, massage it into your being. And then you hand it off to the meditation, which is when you go from you go from ingest, digest to metabolize. Then the teachings become you. They actually become the very fabric of your being. And the really cool thing about this, and this is super important, is that as you work your way down, what I call the process of waking down, it's like a filtration and purification system. Because when you're still doing what we're doing here, you're using dualistic language, concept, and all these things. But as you drop through contemplation, it becomes more and more embodied. It becomes truer, less conceptual, more embodied. It's you're actually filtering away concept. And so when you get finally to the final stage of incorporation, now it's completely fully embodied, and it's a type of Gnosticism. It's a type of knowing where your body knows, because why? It remembers. That's why when you bring it down, your body will say, I already knew this. I know this. And that's what creates the big clicks, the big ahas. It's like, wow, here we go. So this is super important. So all the seemingly intellectual, heady, philosophical stuff, this is just the first phase of ingest, digest, metabolize, and bringing it into your soma, into your body. That's where the change takes.
I love that's your Venus and Taurus in the top of your chart. The respect you have for the physical world in the name of flowers and rocks and trees and the real solid real in your philosophical self. That's the contrast. So many people spend their time in their world in the earth and they do these magical, mystical things and they create buildings and they create governments. But to actually internalize it, to your point, and to put it into the soul's voice.
That's it. And then the great thing there, Deborah, is the really cool thing, and you've noticed this with the really genuine masters from any tradition, they don't have to say a word. They transform, transmit the teachings through their very being, their very presence.
That's why
And
it's all telepathy on the other side. I really, anyone has a near-death experience or whenever, like that experience I had just recently, there's no words.
yeah,
There's no
that's right.
word. It's a telepathic downloading. And this is the part of the mind that is so insistent. I'm going to talk and I'm going to talk and I'm going to think and I'm a Gemini. And I've got a million ideas and my moon's in Virgo. That would be you. And I'm going to keep analyzing the shit out of everything. And at the end of the day, can everyone just be quiet for a minute? And that's when the body comes into the picture. And I love that you said that. I want to give that to our audience as astrology students. We can spend our whole lives off planet. And I am in love, as you know, with the implications and the symbology and the legacy and the mythology. There's so much to be spoken to. And then back at the ranch, there's this temple I live in. And I know I've seen it with you because I know with the scare that you got during your Saturn return that your body said, excuse me, can you take care of me? And that includes the feelings of hugs and love and making love. And please out there, we get so caught in social media. We spend so much time with these. I mean, really.
Bad news. Yeah. And, again, you're hitting such wonderful topics here, Deborah. One is that, we tend to have, there's two paths I think they're super important to keep in mind: the path of spirit or ascent, and the path of soul or descent. And we need both of them because in the West, because we're, whether we know it or not, brought up in theistic Abrahamic traditions, where basically it's about peak experiences, height and light. Well, if it's all just height and light, you get high altitude sickness and sunburn. You're just going to get lost in headspace. So for every step you take up and out, take another step down and in. And so you mentioned earlier, actually, I'm not sure you mentioned this, my deep interest and passion in practices of the dark, like literally dark retreat. So I go into the earth because, it's part of my incorporation thing. I literally go into a cave. I literally go into the darkness because I realize how easy it is to get lost in this headspace. And that part of my body, my charter is to work with my body. And that means going into the body of this planet, into darkness, where it's about higher for me at this point is inner. And so it's about depth and the interior journey. So I think balancing those is really important. Uniting heaven and earth, intellect with intuition, mind with heart, again, in this kind of integral spirit, incorporate and balance all those. Because otherwise, in the spirit of alignment that I mentioned earlier, if we emphasize one or the other, we're going to be out of alignment. And that's one way to talk about, on a larger cosmic scale, what's happening today at the meta crisis of the world itself.
Is that it's going out of balance because there's this. I just watched this really scary podcast about this man, Mo Bita. He's from Egypt and he's I'm going to send you the link. And it was the most brilliant. It was called The Diary of a CEO. It was a podcast. And this man is an expert on AI. And he basically said that if there's not a governor or a parent or legislation or some kind of imposing of human gentleness and human mindfulness and human compassion, AI will not have our best interest.
Yeah, no kidding. And it's interesting to say that because I've actually been invited, as serendipity would have it, I'm actually working and so to speak, slightly advising certain pretty high level AI people that are doing really innovative, cutting edge AI work. And they're bringing in some super interesting, even contemplative approaches to actually work with this issue because I really,
that is the
yeah.
most important thing he said. He was so stressed. The guy was the world's expert on AI. I'm going to send
Oh,
you.
well,
And he was like, unless people like you start instructing people like them, we are dangerous. So this is very
yeah.
positive. You have such an optimistic, I'm curious about this. What provides that uplifted energetic that you live with, like the joy factor or the
Oh,
optimism?
you're so sweet. Yeah, well, a couple things, two things. One is that the whole thing is just a big joke. And I don't mean to dismiss all the suffering and everything that's happening in the world, not in the slightest. But at a very deep level, when you have the big awakening, first of all, you might discover it's the ultimate letdown. That in itself is a big joke. There's just so much humor. And talk about, you mentioned earlier my kind of connectivity to water. Well, what is the etymology of the word, origin of the word humor? Liquid, liquidity. So humor and liquidity are intimately connected, right? So my passion with water manifests in my playful, childlike, flexible way of looking at things. So that's one thing. The second thing is when I look really, really deeply into the nature of things, mind, reality is a deep, deep curious. I realize truly, fundamentally, underneath all the shit show that we're seeing in the meta crisis, this world is beneficent. It is loving. It is kind. It is basically made of the fabric of love, basic goodness, Buddha nature, whatever you want to call it. And so, because of that, I can't help but be optimistic because that to me is the very fabric of things. It's just how it's been covered over, how it's been obscured. That's the tragedy. And so, again, connecting us to
Dark,
the,
what is it about the dark that wants nothing more than to take us and kidnap us and reduce our ability to stay in positive? That's very Scorpio, by the way. What is it that keeps the darker side so seductive and distracting?
well, so I know when you say darker, this is another one of these multivalent terms. So it sounds to me like you're talking about what I call lower phase darkness, darkness in the classic, traditional, more negative, pejorative sense, right?
Opposite of believing that this place is love would be the dark version of we're just a bunch of monkeys.
Yeah. Again, that's our habit patterns. That's the extraordinary force of karma. That's the extraordinary force of the 95% of the unconscious mind that basically sucks us down to these really debased lower levels of identity and being. And it's until we exhaust those karmic patterns, those
I was going
habits.
to ask that, what exhausts them?
One is the revulsion that comes about from recognizing I am just so sick and tired of these same old stories. I'm so sick and tired of the same old bullshit. Real renunciation, real revulsion takes place when we finally give up hope for samsara, right? The carrot is finally dropped. That next relationship's not going to do it. That next job's not going to do it. That next book contract not going to do it. Then, when you're no longer being seduced out into the display, you're finally invited in. And when you're invited in, then you remember, then you recollect, then you see, and then you recognize, oh my gosh, there is this divinity, there is this purity, there is this humor. I just forgot because I've been ironically blinded by the light.
That's hysterical.
It
Like,
is hysterical. It's a tragic comedy. It's Shakespearean in its tragic comedy capacities, right?
I
And
love
if it wasn't so tragic, it would be totally comedic. But what's happening now?
that's what I noticed about you and Esalen. You just kept laughing at your own jokes. I was like, this guy thinks he's really funny. You use humor. It's very Gemini. I do the same. I use humor to tickle me because the truth about this existence, when honoring the higher mind, when you're not captured and you're seduced by the dark, because it's
Yeah.
very, I have a propensity by my bloodline and by my nature, by my personality type, to be prone to go sad. I have to use you can't tell by looking.
Mm,
I have to use my
mm,
muscles to pull myself up. And that's why I love being around Ash, because he thinks everything in the world's funny. And that
mm.
joy, I think what I've noticed about enlightenment is, why is Buddha's belly big? He eats a lot of chocolate and I think he laughs a lot.
Yeah. Yeah. But here's something, Deborah, you might want to reflect on. If you look at the words, first of all, there's a big difference, excuse me, between sadness and depression. There's a big difference between sadness and depression. Depression is a near enemy of sadness. But take a really good look when you're feeling genuinely sad, and perhaps you may notice what I've noticed, that the word is connected literally it comes from a root that is connected to the word satisfaction, satisfy. There's something beautifully satisfying about genuine, authentic sadness. Trungpa talked about it as the genuine heart of sadness. And he actually said, this is such a great statement. He actually said that the ideal emotion is sad joy. Sad joy. This brokenhearted, this feeling of deep connectivity that on one level feels so sad, but on another level, it's so full. It's so rich. It's so joyful.
It's like a ping pong game.
Yeah.
That is exactly where I live. I am so captured by this existence and the fact that it goes on forever and that my evolution continues to reflect itself, said the astrologer. I see how much I'm growing. And I'm so sad for those girls that live in sex.
Yeah.
And
Well,
I think
yeah.
about, I mean, there's so many words I could use to just trigger my whoop.
And then, well, that's so beautiful because then what we do is we engage in that sadness as a form of connectivity that gives birth to compassion. Because then what happens otherwise? Oh, you have this high altitude, beautiful spiritual experience. Well,
Unicorn.
what about the world that's going to hell? What about the election that's just could be catastrophic? Well, to get off our meditative spiritual cushions and engage the world, we engage this brokenheartedness, this sadness in the spirit of compassion, so that we then get into the world, we get off our little whatever, and we do something about it. We work, because otherwise, boy, this is classic spiritual bypassing, right? I mean, you just want up and out. It's all a dream, so who cares? Oh
All
my
the
gosh.
microdosing and all the meds and all the drugs and all the coffee and all the alcohol and all the pot and all the, wow, is there bypassing triggers that I
Totally. And as long as ego is involved, spiritual bypassing is going to be there. So we use this genuine heart of sadness to give birth to compassion. That's real wisdom. I mean, you may express your enlightenment, your wisdom in words, but boy, it isn't until the rubber hits the road that you express your wisdom as compassion that you know your wisdom is actually complete. And that to me, I mean, you've heard me say this over and over, Deborah, if what we're doing in this conversation, if what I'm doing with my work it's not of benefit to the planet and to others, it's irrelevant. I mean, it's really about getting into the world and helping. So yes, we've had this nearly hour conversation of really cool, rich, elevated spiritual stuff. But boy, the bottom line is bringing it into your body, bringing it into the world, and helping the world. That's the point. That's what it really all comes down to.
And as an astrologer, helping the world starts with you falling in love with you. Like as
That's
soon
it.
as astrology, as soon as you do that self-discovery, like, oh, he's got Gemini, Moon, and Virgo. He can't stop if he wanted to. He had Saturn and Scorpio. He made a promise to go into in the fourth house, the deepest levels of the unconscious, and make it conscious. Oh, he has Venus on the top of his chart in Taurus. He's in love with this place. Like for me to be able to
Totally.
do that and then watch you in that process that we did through both I love that reading. It was so funny because I came up to him and I said, "Do you want to read?" He didn't know who I was at all, zero. I mean, and then
Right.
he said yes, and I was like, "Why'd you say yes? I could be a stupid astrologer for all you know." And he was like, "I trust." And the
Wow.
next thing you knew, we were having this encounter, and I was like, "Wait, where do you
Right.
live?" He
20
lives.
minutes for me.
You want to come on a bike ride with me? And sure enough, we were on the bike. So permission in this conversation to look at Andrew's work. I really encourage you to get the book, Preparing to Die. If nothing else, put it in your bathroom, give yourself 10, 20 pages at a time and let the thoughts start to sink in. It's not natural at first for the mind to run towards enlightenment. In fact, quite the opposite. We're built to sabotage. Alice Bailey in the esoteric work.
Mm,
The ego does not want to be captured until it becomes so beautiful to be wrapped up in compassion in the name of the soul. You will never leave.
spot on. Spot on. Yeah.
And you remind me of the part of me. I just want to thank you, Andrew. And I'm so thankful today, even because I do wrestle with, it makes me want to cry. I wrestle with the up and down motion of this existence. And I really have
Mm,
to practice consistency is one of my, thank God, thank Goddess, thank angels that I am consistent. And what's also consistent is my sensitivity. So being with you today, under the influence today, the moon's in Cancer, it's a very sensitive day. Rather than judging the fact that this election is coming in to scare the shit out of us, let it be an emotional doorway that you keep your observer on and you track compassion you have for the human condition brought to us by America. It happens all over in every country, that we have the opportunity to realize I am the one we're looking for. It's my job to be the governor, to be the president. And as I take on the leadership role and do my life's work, which is compassion, for each of you need to find that word, you will come home. And then we're all home in America. I think this is crazy. This is built under the influence of Cancer. The United States was a Cancer. It's born July. And it was born with this very generous heart that says, let me help you, let me help you. And now we're in need right now more than ever to be able to remember it's okay.
Yeah.
This too will pass. Don't get worried. We got a long view and focus, said the astrologer and the Buddhist.
Yep.
It's just transitions.
It's just transitions. That's all there fundamentally is just transitions. And to frame it in these final words, my dear, so fun to hang with you. You bring such light and love and wisdom to this world. It's such an honor to be in your event horizon. And really, you've transformed and changed me a lot since we've met each other. So I'm very deeply grateful.
Thank you, thank you, thank you. Okay, so you guys go check out, what do? They find your website by going to?
Oh yeah, so kind. AndrewHolecek.com. I also have a podcast platform myself called Edge of Mind. And then this Preparing to Die program that you referred to is one of my more recent contributions. So that's where they can find out my propaganda and what I'm doing. So thank you for that.
Andrew, yes, and thank you.
Thank you so much for listening. We want to keep this conversation going with you, so please subscribe to our podcast and leave a rating and review to make sure you never miss an episode. Remember, climate activist by day, human by night. Send Debra a DM on Instagram at Debra Silverman Astrology and visit DebraSilvermanAstrology.com. And we're going to leave you like we leave every single episode. Make it your mission to change the world.